So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second FAST lecture of the 2020-2021 academic year. My name is Bailey Franzoy, and I am this year's FAST coordinator. For those of you new to the University of Michigan archaeological community, FAST is the Field Archaeology series on Thursday. So every month, FAST features a public-facing lecture presenting the latest in archaeological research from University of Michigan students, faculty, and researchers, and some non-Michigan affiliated scholars. FAST is generously supported by the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, the Department of Classical Studies, and the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology, also known as IPCA. But FAST is ultimately made possible by an eager and engaged audience and world-class speakers. So thanks to all of you for your attendance this evening and continued participation in our intellectual community. I'll ask that you please hold your questions for our speaker until the end of the talk. If you're worried about forgetting your question, you can type it into the chat, and I'll read it out when it's time for Q&A. As per proper Zoom etiquette, I would ask that you please keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking during the Q&A. The actual presentation and this introduction is being recorded, while the Q&A portion will not. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Irene Sotomaren, Assistant Professor of Classical Studies and Assistant Curator here at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. She received her BA in Ancient Studies and Anthropology from Barnard College, Columbia University, and earned her MA and PhD from the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. As an economic historian, her research is rooted in questions of trade and monetary integration in antiquity, focused in particular on late Roman Egypt. Her curatorial work at the Kelsey focuses on its vast numismatic collection, seeking to highlight the relationship of the many excavated coins to their archaeological context. And she is also researching the Greco-Roman Egypt material from the Michigan excavated site of Koranis. Her lecture this evening is titled Domus, Wine Cellars, and Churches at Amheida, Late Antique Ceramic Contexts in an Egyptian Oasis. Please welcome Dr. Sotomaren.
Thank you, everyone. All right, let me see if I can share screen. Oh, it says I am disabled from screen sharing.
That is weird. Can you share now?
Yeah, now yes.
Okay, great.
Cool. So first of all, I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. As you know, this is my first semester in Michigan, which has been a little bit peculiar. Given the pandemic, I actually haven't gotten to spend some time out with a lot of you. So it's kind of nice, at least, to be able to get together in these circumstances. So yes, so I'll start now. Well, people say it takes a village, but in the case of Amheida, I think it takes several countries. This is an incredibly international and collaborative project, and I'm perpetually indebted to the whole team at Amheida. I would like to thank Professor Roger Bagnall, my doctoral advisor and founder and director for the project, Professor Paola Davoli, the archaeological director of the Excavations, and Professor Nicola Ravecchia and Dr. Roberta Casagrande Kim, who were the lead archaeologists of two of the contexts I will be talking about. I would especially like to thank my colleague, Dr. Clementina Caputo, the head ceramicist at Amheida, whom I have worked with for over a decade and who has taught me so much about ceramic analysis and Egyptian ceramics in general. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Stefania Alfarano, who besides excavating, has literally lost sleep numerous times drawing the ceramics. I have been working at Amheida since I was 19 years old. So in a way, I very much grew up on the site. So I'm particularly excited to be able to share with my new Michigan family, my Amheida family. I think most of you know me probably as the coin person, and I still very much am. But actually, much of my fieldwork research has been centered around ceramics. And it was my interest in ceramics and in long distance trade that actually fostered me to start studying numismatics when I was in graduate school. So they're very much related, at least in my head. Egypt is widely known as the gift of the Nile, the river which represents the main source of irrigation for nearly the entire land, and whose floods are necessary for Egypt's livelihood and its economic and political stability. There are places in Egypt, however, beyond the Nile, large oases buried deep in the western desert, whose livelihood depends, unlike the rest of Egypt, on large underwater aquifers and artesian wells that are part of the larger Nubian aquifer. Located about 10 days away by Karam from the Nile Valley, these oases were places of not only isolation, but also connection, as they have served as major hubs in trade routes to Nubia since the pharaonic period. which is evidenced by major Old Kingdom governors' palaces found in Dakhleh, for example. And here you have, I think, one of my favorite sites in Dakhleh. The perennial irrigation offered by the constant flow of water from natural spring mounds and artesian wells meant that the oasis provided and continued to provide a suitable environment for crops which necessitate year-round irrigation, such as vineyards, olive groves, fruit trees, and in later periods, even cotton. Already in antiquity, Herodotus, Strabo, and Olympiodorus wrote about the lushness of Egypt's western oases. Herodotus even goes so far as to call the oasis islands of the blessed. The Dakhleh and Kharga Oasis, or Oasis Magna as it was known in antiquity, represented a high source of revenue for the Roman Empire. The three main cities, Mothis, Hibis, and Trimithis, were important administrative centers in the region, all of them achieving the status of polis with their own city councils by the end of the 3rd century. Here's the Dakhleh Oasis, and here's the Kharga Oasis. They're actually part of the same depression, but they're separated by about 2 hours. The Dakhleh Oasis measures around 80 kilometers from east to west, and about 25 kilometers from north to south. Well-known evidence from a Leipzig papyrus, P-Lips 164, dating to the late 360s, presents a tax assessment for the oasis, which shows Trimithis as an area with a substantial tax base. According to the editors of the papyrus, the tax liability of Trimithis and its district was about 3/4 that of the largest cities of Mothis and Hibis, which were the administrative capitals of the Dakhleh and Kharga oasis, respectively. Amheida, or Trimithis, stands in the northwestern part of the Dakhleh Depression in a barren area located about 3 kilometers from the modern village of Archaeologists. Modern, but dating back to the medieval period, is quite old. It's a UNESCO protected site. The landscape of the oasis is quite patchy, with agricultural fields intertwined with dry patches of land. The Dakhleh Oasis project first identified the site in its survey of sites in the whole oasis in 1977 and 1978. And that site of Amheida began being excavated in 2006. You can see here, I want to highlight the agricultural fields surrounding Amheida. There are things underneath these fields, but the site properly as it stands in modern times is this main area over here. All of these yellow things that you see here are actually sand dunes. They look like this. From above, they look quite flat, but actually they can be quite tall, several meters in height at times. Yes. Geomorphological and archaeological surveys of the site has revealed that Roman Amheida was constructed on an uneven area of fossilized dunes, soft dunes, mounds of clay, and lower lands near spring mounds where wells provisioned the water supply for the city. And I would like to call your attention to this contrast, right? We have spring mounds, which tend to be quite humid, and then we have sand dunes as well from the erosion coming from the desert. This line that you see here in the back is actually not a mountain, that's the desert line. So that's like let's say the desert proper. It's just that oases are usually depressions in the desert. The area was already inhabited since the Old Kingdom, though at present it is unclear how big the settlement was at that time and what, if anything, preceded it. Thus, there is evidence of occupation between the Old Kingdom to the late Roman period, with an abandonment date sometime in the late 4th century CE. Located in the northwest edge of the oasis, Amheida is exposed to very strong winds and sand dunes coming from the Saharan plateau and moving through the site about 7 meters per year. The erosion is so extreme at times that very little survives of buildings and walls on the higher parts of the site. The lower parts, in contrast, have incredible levels of preservation caused by meters of accumulated windblown sand. Here you can see a little bit of walls here. There's still preservation beneath them, but there's even some standing buildings. Here is just to see that contrast, right? We have some walls over here. There's some flatter walls here, and then once you excavate, you can actually have several meters in height. Here's probably like a better contrast. This is on top of the temple hill, where the erosion has basically eroded most of the material, and we just have pits of where some of the blocks of the temple used to be. There are still some blocks that have been found, but the level of preservation on top of the hills is very different than in the lower parts of the site. Erosion has also caused the desiccation of mud brick walls, which were constructed partly using broken sherds of ceramics, and whose collapse has left behind millions of pottery sherds scattered throughout the site. An early survey of the site estimated the surface ceramics at around 330 million sherds, and they are often the only remaining evidence of previous buildings and walls. In case we had any doubts about the surface, the vast amount of ceramics, along with the identification of at least 5 Roman kilns and the excavations and surveys done of the site, have made it clear that we are dealing with a large local pottery production. Now, before I continue, I feel like I have to do a bit of a praeteritio and mention a lot of things that I'm not going to be able to talk about, sadly, because of the scope of this paper. We have the baths that were constructed in the Roman period with baked bricks that are still they still need to be excavated fully. This part has been excavated. We have numerous texts and ostraka, hundreds of them, which include letters, well tacks, and very different stuff. And we also have basically blocks from the temple, which here is, I think this is from the late period that the University of Leiden is working on right now. And then I'll mention a little bit the painted walls in the site. Sorry, I'm trying to find my place in the paper. Okay, yeah, sorry. Today, however, I will focus on 3 ceramological contexts I have worked with. The House of Serenos, a city council appearing numerous texts from Amheida, House B10 and its wine cellar and kitchen, and my current work with the ceramics of the church, Building 7. The large House of Serenos was the focus of the excavations in Amheida from 2004 until 2007, and its 2 adjacent streets, one of which was appropriated into a courtyard, were excavated from 2008 to 2010. Containing 16 rooms and 2 floors, the house was large and the windblown sand allowed for a good level of preservation of the walls. You can see how even the mud plaster on top of the building has survived. So let me go back a little bit. This is the northern part, the northern facing wall of the site. And we have here a plan of the walls. You can see them there. This is like a recreation of what they look like. We actually have a replica villa that was built as part of the museum. And then this is like the plan of the site. This is north. So this picture is rivers, in case it wasn't clear. This is one of the streets, Street 2. You can see there's a stibaria here. It actually was a street, and then it was appropriated into the House of Serenos at a later stage. Okay. You can see here how even the mud plaster and the bricks has been preserved. So this is like the house once it's been excavated. And this is what I was talking about with the level of preservations of the site. We have the top that is very destroyed, and then once we excavate lower levels where the houses are, for example, we have up to 2 to 3 meters of preservation. And we even have, mud brick, baked mud brick with mud brick plaster. We have 4 phases of occupation that has been identified by Paola Davoli. We have the imperial baths, which is contemporary with the building I showed you earlier. We have the leveling with debris from the baths. So the bath was destroyed, then the debris was brought into the house, then the construction of private houses, which included B1, and then the habitation phases from 340 to 370. And let's keep this date in mind because it seems to coincide with the abandonment of the site. Then there is a post-abandonment period where we find some mostly ceramic material that we found that seems to belong to the 5th century, but we're not quite sure yet. One of the Domus' most memorable aspects, which I will not talk about in this lecture, are its wall paintings and the schoolroom containing text on the walls, as you can see here. These have been published by Raffaella Cribiori. They're scholastic texts, essentially. The paintings, actually, you can see Polis here. This is a personification of Amheida, and it depicts a lot of mythological scenes. The paintings are currently being published by Susanna McFadden. Part of the ceramics actually includes ostraka, which Roger Bagnall, Rodney Ass, and Giovanni Ruffini have published. And most of them, the first belongs to the House of Serenos, the first volume, most of them, not all of them. But we can see Serenos here with his family, or we think it is at least a personification because this is his house. But the full catalog and analysis of the ceramics of the house was just published this year by Dr. Clementina Caputo with contributions by Dr. Julie Marchand and myself. And it was actually the first piece of mail that I received at the Kelsey. So I found it very appropriate to be the subject of my first talk at the Kelsey. It was initially through the excavations of B1 that we got to know the pottery of Amheida. And so this ceramic catalog will serve as a useful guide for the other late antique context of the site. As you can see from the quantification done by Caputo, the majority of the pottery from the Domus of Serenos features shapes and functional groups associated with domestic contexts, such as bowls, cooking pots and their lids, storage jars, basins, and craters, with the exception of late Roman amphora 7, Oasis red slipware, and this flask made of yellow slipware. Most of the vessels are actually made from a local ceramic. So when we look at this quantification, it's another indication that we're actually dealing with a very wide local production, just given the amount of different types of pottery that is being manufactured in the oasis. Although homogeneous in fabric, the assemblage is much more colorful than one might expect, as bowls and cooking vessels often feature decorations on the rims and in the interiors. Here you can see just a representation of some types of bowls. We can see here these footed bowls that we have that actually served as lids as well for pots. I'll have a picture of one of those in another context more clearly. We have also this edge, like slip edge, with a ridge, the rim with a ridge where a lid would have sat. And you can see also that there's various different types of colors. Most of the ceramic would have been marked with ticks around the rims, and a lot of it was whitewashed. So there was like a semi-aesthetic decorative aspect to them. This one in particular, I think was really interesting because it contained a lot of ochre inside. So we think it could have been, some kind of pigment that was being used. And it's still, you pick up the part, it was just full of ochre when we found it inside of the house. This is one of the very traditional cooking pots of the site. We did a variation of the rims as well, and there's so much variation within the same stratigraphic unit of different types of cooking pots that it's another indication that we have numerous manufacturers of ceramics, or availability of clay, since cooking pots usually don't travel very far, they're not locally made. We also have lids with plaster on them, and we have the necks of wine jars. There's a large crater, decorated crater, that has been restored. Being a member of the city elite, however, Serenos was also able to afford certain types of imported materials that indicate a high level of status, such as bowls of Oasis red slipware, which was an imitation of African red slipware, and several individuals of late Roman amphora 7, a wine amphora commonly produced in Middle Egypt, and a well-known appearance in late antique context in Egypt. Given the fact that it took about 10 days in antiquity to travel to Dakhleh from the Nile Valley, the Roman amphora 7 amphora should be considered imports. Several fragments of amphora from Rhodes as well were found in the house. This is an example of it, showing that Serenos had also a taste for wine outside of Egypt as well. So technically this is an Egyptian amphora, but let's remember how far away we are from the Nile Valley. So, and it's something that it's also interesting is that the ceramics themselves have a very different color than ceramics that were produced in the Nile Valley. So when you're looking at ceramics from Egypt, because they're from alluvial clay that has been washed down by the Nile, they tend to be very dark. They have a lot of like a rich chocolate color, but the ceramics from the oasis actually have a much lighter calcium, sometimes calcium rich, but there's a lot of iron, and they have a more reddish tone. And they're a little harder as well than the alluvial clay from the valley. Here you can see an amphora with the stopper even that was found. One of the most useful contexts that we excavated, however, so all of these ceramics come from habitational contexts in the House of Serenos. As I told you, there's 4 different levels that we found, and in order to analyze, what they were actually using or utilizing of the houses being inhabited, we had to use the ceramics that come from the habitational levels of the house. So mainly this third phase of occupation. And that's where most of these ceramics come from. There is, however, other earlier levels that also were really useful to understand. And for me, one of the most useful ones was actually a dump, or a construction field to be more precise, since it made evident that large-scale manufacture of disposal of two particular types of locally produced vessels. One of them, the wine jar, which I'll talk about now, and the other one, the keg, which I will talk about in a second. Based on ostraka, ceramics, mud stoppers, and surveys of the site, we knew that there was a wine production in the region of Amheida. So we found a lot of these wine jars. The fragile nature of the mud stopper, along with the shape of the jar, which was large, wonky, doesn't really have a base. If you look at this amphora, for example, there's a very nice toe that makes it easy to transport and also kind of makes it really sturdy. This wine jar has no base, so it kind of makes it a little more fragile. Well, this meant that we never really found a complete vessel or a complete stopper. We knew there were a lot of them, and we also found a lot of well tags in ostraka. And these were published as part of the Amheida volumes that I mentioned. We call them well tags because they mention wells. Sorry, I lost my place again. Okay, so this is a house B10, or the house of the poet, as we call it. It is known as that from like an old tale before I got there, that apparently someone brought an inscription coming from this region that contained a poem. We don't know exactly if it was from this. It was like a workman found it, or someone from the village found it, like a plaster piece with an inscription, which is, that did happen. What we don't know is exactly where it came from. He's generally pointed in this region, and we did find some graffiti once we excavated this area, but it's still unclear if this poem actually came from this side. But anyway, it's called the House of the Poet, which I think is a very nice name to it. The first excavations of B10 consisted on the removal of a wall collapse in the westernmost room of the house. So this is here, you can see it. This is a collapse. The removal of the collapse uncovered a wine cellar with over 50 wine jars closed with stoppers. So you can see this is the first impression that we got as soon as we removed the bricks, on which small ostraka were embedded as labels. Some of them were complete. I don't think any one of these pictures is complete, but you can see the wine. There's one right here, another here, here. So we knew we were dealing with a lot of complete individuals. It is not evident, their standardized size and dimensions, as well as the series of years written on them, have not only securely dated these jars to the first half of the 4th century, they have also emphasized this preferred shape for the local conservation of wine. So before we found this, we knew that this shape existed because we kept finding different parts of the body, and we kept finding the ostraka tags. But this is the first context where we actually found at least 2 vessels that were complete with the stopper. This one is completely sealed still, and this is the famous well tag that Roger has been analyzing, actually proved to be wine labels. Exportation of wine from the oasis of the Nile Valley is well attested from the 18th dynasty up to the New Kingdom. And although there is no direct evidence of exportation during the Greco-Roman period, it is clear wine was actively produced. Numerous accounts, tags, and receipts related to wine can be attested, but perhaps the best illustration of its active consumption in the site comes from this single context in the house. These 2 vessels are complete. I have often been asked if we tried the wine inside of them. We did not. Wine is no longer liquid after 1,700 years, in case you were curious. And we were not really interested in damaging complete artifacts. Some of the other broken vessels contain substantial residue, or gunk as I call it, that is waiting to be analyzed. Actually, you can kind of see one here. If you look at this one, it looks black, but that's not a shadow. That's actually the pitch lining of the wine jars. And a lot of them were broken. Like this one, you can tell it's been dried up, but a lot of them were broken still with enough grape and wine material. Now, if you notice here, you'll see a lot of this little what looks like little bits of mudbrick. A lot of them are actually seeds. So grape seeds. So we think there was grape being kept in this wine cellar along with the wine. And they're being analyzed as well by botanists. The association of the well tags, this one, to each jar of wine has meant that the quantification of the ostraka and the ceramics allows us to have a picture of the active vineyards on the side. In addition to the 57 wine jars in B10, 72 well tags were found in one stratigraphic unit. So far in total, out of the excavation of 2 houses and 1 bath complex in the site, about 340 well tags from wine jars have been found. So about 340 jars, essentially. The number of wells listed in the ostraka would also serve as an indicator of the scale of agriculture in the region. So far, about 40 different wells bearing the name with pamoon, which means like the water off, or the well off, have been attested. So I think that for us, this was kind of important because I don't think I know any other piece of ceramic that has a precise date, let's say, on the sherd. Those of you that have studied ceramics know that usually ceramic chronology ranges about, a tight chronology will be 30, 40 years for one type of vessel. 50, I think 50 more feasible, but to have like 1 year per one jar is actually quite rare. So this is what a wine label usually looks like. For the papyrologists in the audience, if you want more discussions on the methodology, you can look at Roger's analysis on this. But usually the well just had the year date, which corresponded to the regnal year of senior emperors, the name of the well, and the name of the individual. And they're actually quite small, as you can see here. So what Roger did was he took the 50, I think it was 52 labels that we had and seriated them in the year with the regnal year to figure out which candidates it could be. And it turned out the only potential candidates could be Constantine or Constantius II, because those are the only one that reigned long enough to have, year, I think it's year 17 or something of reign. But Constantius II was not senior emperor during his 10th and 12th years. So that means that we know securely it had to be Constantine. If you want more on the methodology of this, I suggest you look at this article that we published a couple of years ago, where Roger goes through the whole process on how we were able to date the wine jar so well. And we actually have a very tight chronology for these vessels. We have been able to date them between 335, around 335 CE, which is a very tight, as I said, chronology for ceramics is very, very unheard of that we have such a good chronology. So B10 continued to be full of surprises that season. As right beneath the wine cellar rubble, we found essentially a kitchen with many vessels still in situ. And you can see here beneath, so once we took off, sorry to go back, this wine jar, so we have, the collapse of the rubble on top of the wall, we had the wine jars, then we removed those, and then we had the collapse of the wall. This proved to be a second floor of the house. So what you see here is a second floor that collapsed, which means this is essentially also a second floor. So you can see the type of level of preservation that we have at Amheida in the lower parts of the town. It's just there's been so much windblown sand that actually it has helped to maintain the structures as well. So once we removed that, these are the walls essentially, and we found a kitchen. This, of course, we found on the last day of excavation, as it usually happens on excavation. You found the most interesting stuff the last day. So as you can tell, it's actually a very rare context because we have a lot of, you can see this all one vessel, this is another vessel. And usually what you want to do is you want to collect all the fragments very carefully so you can reconstruct the ceramic vessels again. It was actually really hard for our photogrammetries to walk around to be able to do a photogrammetry of this context because it's covered with ceramics. So what we think is that the collapse of the second floor happened while this was being still inhabited to some extent. It was full of archaeobotanicals as well that are also being analyzed right now. There was a series of ostraka that were found, and in one of the jars we found also grains and I think the skeleton of a mouse as well inside one of the jars. Poor thing, died happy at least. So this is just the kind of, you can see in situ of the bowls that we have full of soot. I mean, this is really a kitchen properly. We have a cooking pot. This is the remains of some wine jars that fell from the top, presumably. But I mean, for me, I really like daily life and, economics. So cooking is quite, to find a kitchen like this is actually quite incredible. Let me see. Okay. I will also find some wooden pieces as well, or boxes of wood that were, I don't think you can see it here. I think it was covered. So what we did with this, we didn't excavate it, we just recovered it and waited for a following season to excavate it. Now, hills around the site contain a large accumulation of wasters and dumped material from strong ceramic industry geared towards the production of kegs and wine jars. So we knew already there was a big industry based on these hills. I'm sorry, I failed to mention where we are on the site. So the house that we just saw, B10 with the wine jar, is over here. The house of Serenos is a little further down on the site on this area generally. And this is the church that we'll be talking about. So generally we're focused on this area of the site, areas 2 and 8, which are the late antiques areas. There's some areas around here in the outer skirts that seem to date to earlier periods, but again, it's a very big site, so we haven't really systematically looked at everything yet. But this plan is actually quite useful. I also take this opportunity to highlight the fact that this is essentially a dump. Look how high it is. You can see it's about at least 6 or 7 meters high. And look at how large it is as well. And it's sitting on top of other sand dunes. Now, you may be able to tell from the map that there are sand dunes going through the site, which means that essentially, you can't stop a sand dune from moving. Once it's coming your way, it's coming. So it's been good for the preservation of the site, but it also, it means that certain areas we just cannot excavate. There's too much sand. But slowly as they move, they show other things that are beneath them, like structures or streets, for example. So based on these dumps, we have been able to identify another main product of the site that is actually not present in large numbers in domestic contexts, which is what I will talk about next. One of the hypotheses that I think that has been proposed for the economic revenue of the site actually lies in the production of another type of vessel, which are the kegs. I have one here actually. This is the potter at the Alcázar that made this keg, but this is the shape of the vessel. It's actually really hard in antiquity to find one, or an ancient one, because the shape is so awkward that it actually breaks very easily. You can see a modern one here. There's some scattered ones that we've seen around the site, and here's one of the modern potters using an Islamic era pottery wheel to make the ceramics. The vessels are distinctly shaped in an elongated ovoid form with a rounded or grooved lip and cylindrical lower neck protruding from the side of the body. They are one of the main ceramic products of the Western Desert and have a strong tradition of manufacture that continues to the present. In the Great Oasis, the production of kegs has been attested in the 5th century BC or the 27th dynasty. This coincides with the Persian occupation of the oasis, and I think is perhaps maybe even tied to investment in agriculture during this period, since we know that Persians were also invested in irrigation and canals. Exportation to the Nile Valley of the vessel with its contents already occurred during this period. The kegs discovered at Karnak North and on the Farshid Road cannot be precisely identified as coming from either Dakhleh or Hargam, given their similarity in raw materials, but it is certain that their origin lies in the southern oasis. A survey of the road to Farafra, which you see here, which leads to the oasis not far from Alcázar, so this road is actually not far from Amheida. Ascending the scarp revealed various rims of the kegs commonly found in Amheida. Now, Roger Bagnall suggested, based on the Kelly's Agricultural Account Book and papyri from Dakhleh, that olive oil was potentially exported to the rest of Egypt, given that it was not produced on a wide scale in the Nile Valley. I think this is a likely hypothesis, as to this day the olive oil tree is one of the major tree crops in Dakhleh. Alum, also used as a mordant for dyeing textiles, could have been a profitable export. In the future, I would be interested in doing some kind of surveys of the site of Panopolis and Lycopolis, which are at the end of these oasis trade routes, to see if we have more kegs there and properly identify them by fabric, so we can say, okay, these comes from also from Amheida. So I think olive oil was one of the most likely products that they would be carrying, given the high value. Of course, you're not gonna carry something through the desert for 10 days unless it's worth the economic trip, and very few things would be worth it that coming from the oasis, wine or kegs. The kegs are not pitched on the inside. They don't have the same remember the dark layers we saw in the wine jars? That's very common to put inside wine amphora to seal it. We don't have that inside of kegs. So that means that was probably not wine that they were transporting. So I think the other option is olive oil. They could also be carrying dates or alum, but given look at the size of the neck, I really think it should be a liquid. Some people have suggested water, which could also be water, but it's also quite heavy. I think water might be easier carried in animal skins or something of the type. But it doesn't mean that there's also only one product carried in them. It could be, various types as well. As an economic historian, I try to think a little rationally, like, why would you take these very heavy vessels across a 10-day caravan? And given that olive oil is not that widely produced in Egypt during this period in the Nile Valley, because of the type of irrigation it needs, I think it makes sense that it would be carried in kegs and produced in the oasis. The last context, which I will present today, is actually part of my current research. So I talked a little bit about stuff that I've already published on, and I put some of the citations there in case anyone is interested. But this is actually part of my current fieldwork research, which is why I thought it would be perfect to talk about for this fast lecture. This is B7, located in relatively the same area of the site as the House of Serenus. Now, the majority of the church was excavated in 2012 and 2013, but some rooms remain to be finished. So I will just give you like a brief overview up to the state up to now of what we know about the church. It was excavated by Professor Nicola Ravecchio, who was actually Washington University in St. Louis, so not that far from us. I don't know, I think that not far from us. I don't know, I failed to measure Midwest distances, but it seems like it's nearby. It's still Midwest. Okay, so this is a better view. So architecturally speaking, B7 is very typical of early churches in the oasis. We see the columns here around the central room. You can see remains of columns here, with mastaba benches around the walls. So I'll show you a little bit, but this is one of the mastaba benches that survives. To the east, we have a platform where the sanctuary would have been. So this is the east, and the platform north is this way. These rooms remain to be excavated over here. I'll show you a map in a second so you can see. But as you can see from the plan, numerous burials were also found within the church, and they're currently being analyzed by our physical anthropologist, Professor Tasha Dupra. So here we see tombs inside of room 1, which is like the main sanctuary. Here's another tomb. And here's the north of the side, north of the side is here. So it seems to be the entrance to the west. Here's one of the mastaba benches I talked about. But architecturally speaking, there are a lot of comparanda to these churches in the oasis in the site of Cellars, and also in Harga. So they seem to be matching some more or less similar architectural plans. Now, these rooms over here have not been finished excavated, including this room 2, which from what I understand, is also one of the most important parts of the church. We also need to know what's here. There's a big unknown. I was going to write a question mark because it still hasn't been excavated. We know there's a big wall here. The bodies found in the crypt 2 are still in situ. And from my understanding, this is the only instance of a church of this century in Egypt with containing an untouched crypt. You can see here's this room 2 with the crypt inside, and the bodies are still there. So everything has been reburied. We have a very good policy about reburying stuff that we're not ready to preserve, especially if it's paintings, if it's human bodies. Unless we're ready to treat them, we usually leave them in situ. Among other finds, there are wooden objects and several hundred pieces of painted plaster. As you can see, this is actually collapsed from the roof, which would have decorated, mainly the roof. It seems like the walls were painted white, as you can see from this one. Some in the mastaba, you can see some over here. But the roof seems to have been all decorated, and it was essentially pulverized when it landed on the floor. So we have I counted about 20 trays of these. So if anyone likes jigsaw puzzles, we do have all of the plaster pieces. So I'm sure we can fly you to Amheida and just put them together slowly. And we also found this weird object that I like to think is a flute, but I don't know what it is. Just put it there as a potential idea of what it could be. Now, for those of you of little faith that this is a church, we also found this. It cracks me up. There's a piece of plaster also from room 1 with an inscription here that says Ho Theos, which is basically allowed us to identify a little bit, in case the plan and everything else didn't identify. So basically have, the Lord here written in Greek. Here's Omicron, here's Theta, Epsilon, Omicron, Sigma. And here's another well tag that actually been published and translated, because I wanted to mention that we do have some continuity of material, of course, on the site. Here you can see this Ultramythis 732, second year Hudreuma, which is Hudreuma of cotton, of the vineyard of Sai, son of Colantes. So you can see there's actually a lot of abbreviations going in the text, which is how they're able to fit so much information in this little dinky piece of ceramic. This is what our local clay looks like, as you have seen from other stuff I've shown you, very red, iron rich. So you have your year 2, this is beta, the etus sign, and Hudreuma, which is here, upsilon, delta, ereox, ho, it is abbreviated, saitos, and then colanthon, colantu, sorry. So they're actually quite readable. Once you get, my understanding as well, I mean, I've only read a few myself, but Roger and Rodney told me that once you see one, the other 400 that you find are very formulaic. And they're quite interesting, as a corpus to look at. They're wine labels, essentially. So far, the ceramics from the church, which is what I'm working on, seem to belong to an earlier phase than the latest habitational phases of the House of Serenus, so they seem to predate. But this should be expected given the level of erosion in the context. Now remember that I told you we have very different levels of preservation depending on the exposure to wind and erosion. The church is actually sitting on top of a hill. So what happens is that, erosion comes, destroys some of the walls collapse, and the material gets slowly destroyed, which means that earlier levels are preserved. So that my guess or approximations that we did have much later context in the church, and based on surface ceramics and other things that we've been able to find, but the secure contexts are only those that have been preserved from the erosion, which tend to be a little earlier. There are also complete vessels that were recovered from the excavations. So they have these cooking pots and incense burners, and they generally belong, they have a wide chronology, but they generally belong to the 4th century. So with this type of rim that we have here, we have incense burners. There's also a local calcium-rich fabric as well that we have. So it looks a little greener, but these are actually a little rarer to find. I mean, we do find them throughout the site, but this type of fabric seems to have been reserved for more like special objects or more like finer wear in general. In room 7 of the church, a kitchen or a stove seems to have been uncovered. And we did a kind of staging with complete cooking pots from other contexts. It was actually very neat because we were able to fit almost perfectly a cooking pot that we have into one of the stove orifices. So, it fits perfectly. And this is the footed bowls that I was telling you about, that they actually fit as lids very well. So we have a wide tradition of cooking vessels, and it's kind of nice to find the context to which they belong. That's why I really like excavating kitchens and stoves in the sites. Some preliminary results of the ceramics analyzed in B7 seems to indicate that the vessels found in these contexts are very much in line with contemporary layers of the site, so indicating again, a strong local production of cooking wares and wine, and occasional imports from the Nile Valley, because I have found a couple of toes of amphora, late Roman amphora 7. One of the things I want to explore is how to understand more stratigraphically how these layers of ceramic works, and maybe even hypothesize the usage of some of these rooms within a church context as well. Now, some conclusions. Based on all the stuff that I've shown you tonight, the presence of imported amphora from the Nile Valley and Greek islands that I showed you surely speak of a Western oasis that is well connected to the mainstream commercial activities of the Mediterranean world. This connectivity necessitated caravans, which for the 7 to 10-day journey to the Nile Valley would have required a substantial water supply and resources, as well as economic incentive for such a long journey. The question of what drives this caravan business, I believe, is strongly linked to the economic revenue that we saw stemming from the Great Oasis, as we saw in the light of the Leipzig papyrus I mentioned. Surely this apparent economic prowess stems from the capability of growing cash crops that necessitate perennial irrigation, such as vineyards, olive groves, and cotton plants. So in fact, the export nature of the oasis also points to a high degree of self-sufficiency. So yeah, we are talking about connectivity and actually buying, you know, some stuff that comes from outside of the oasis. But the experts, I think, actually talk about a self-sufficiency of the oasis to be able to provide to the rest of the territory in Egypt. I am also interested in questions of economic connectivity in Egypt during years of bad floods and crises. So something that I hope to investigate, I still have to methodologically think how we could figure this out, is to understand how the oasis related economically to the rest of the Egypt during times when the Nile there was a bad drought or there was political turmoil. And you know, these places have long stability, they have perennial irrigation that is constant and not requiring on floods. So one of the things I want to understand is how connected were these economies, especially during times of crisis. So these are just some ideas that I have. Thank you for joining me tonight. And yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, or if I wasn't clear about anything that I've shown you. We went through a lot of material and a lot of contexts. And last but not least, I would like to thank you also from my team, because Excavations is, you know, it takes several countries and universities. So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sotomaren. I know that seeing all of this was amazing, and maybe it's just missing the dig season, but it looks like an amazing site and it's all really cool and awesome to hear about. So I'm going to stop recording and yeah, open it up to questions.